All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And for those of you who got in a little bit early, you're welcome. I'm sure that was quite amusing. Um, we've got a great webinar for you today on volunteer recruitment and retention, tackling the big questions. What I'm going to ask you to do is while you're coming in, go ahead, if you would, use the chat to introduce yourself. Just let us know who you are, what your role is in your literacy organization, and what part of the country you're in. And while you guys are doing that, I'm going to go ahead and talk to you about, in case you didn't know, we're having a conference on adult education in Baltimore this year, October 6th through the 9th, 2024. And you'll see the URL there for information about the conference. We're going to have registration opening up, I think, about the middle of next month. But we've already gone through and gotten a lot of the presentations selected. So it's going to be a really nice lineup. Baltimore is a great place. And hope you guys will be able to join us. One other thing I want to call your attention to before we get into the content is we've scheduled a couple of discussion groups after this webinar. So you'll see they're about the middle of May, so about 3 weeks from now. And we've set them up. They're limited to about 25 people, so first come, first serve. And what the idea is that some of the stuff that we're going to talk about here, if you have additional questions or are going back and thinking about implementing some of the strategies that we're talking about, you want more kind of information or support about how to do that, you can sign up for one of these discussion groups and we'll get together and answer your questions. So it's a opportunity to get a little bit more kind of targeted, personalized service and support. So, all right. I am going to take myself off camera so that it's helpful for the bandwidth there of the video. Okay, so tackling the big questions. So let's start by you guys, I'm assuming, came into this webinar with some questions that you wanted answered regarding volunteer recruitment and retention. So I'm going to give you a couple of minutes and ask you to type those questions into the chat. And we'll just kind of take a look at what those are and see if we can, I have a feeling probably a lot of them are similar to the questions that we had already planned on addressing because those questions came out of a survey that we did a couple of years back. But we'll try to address as many of those questions as we can, and if not, that's a good opportunity for you to sign up for one of the discussion groups. How to keep learners engaged. How do you lay out clear expectations of lengthening training and commitment without scaring people off? That's a great one, Martha. We are definitely going to talk about some strategies for that. We're also going to talk about some strategies for keeping people engaged, strategies for getting volunteers, dealing with people who register as volunteers but then disappear before you can get them into training. All right, that's excellent. We're going to talk about that. Attracting more male and younger tutors, absolutely. How do you keep students engaged? How you know who will be a good volunteer and who will not? Oh, that's a good one, Jessica. Let's see. Down to only about 5 tutors. Oh my gosh. Worry where you're going to get more volunteers to meet the student demand. Holding attendance expectations of people volunteering their time, post-COVID strategies. All right, so these look like some of the questions that we're actually going to address, and I think I'm right in saying like these are also some good things that after we get done with this, and we'll have time for questions at the end as well. And we're going to ask that if you have questions about this, kind of more specific questions, about things that come up during the webinar, we're going to ask that you use the Q&A function to post those questions there, and that way we can kind of keep track and make sure everybody's questions are answered. But I think we're going to address a lot of these, and if we don't get to your question, encourage you to sign up for the discussion groups. So here are some of the questions that were identified by that survey, and you'll see some of these are kind of reflected in the things that you asked about. So how do you recruit good, qualified volunteers? So that was kind of along the lines of what somebody posted. How do you know somebody's going to be good or not? How do you know they're going to take an assignment and not disappear after training? Those sorts of things. Another one was, how do you screen them to make sure they'll complete training and or take an assignment? So there we go. What do you do when volunteers can't commit for 1 year? That's a big one, and we're definitely going to talk about that. How do you keep volunteers interested so they'll stay for a long time? Once we've invested time in training volunteers, we want to keep them around, especially if they're really good. And what do you do to engage tutors when when there are long periods before or between assignments? So kind of keeping those folks engaged. And then the last one, where can you find new and diverse sources of volunteers? So I saw a lot of these for kind of reflected in the questions that you guys posted in the chat. All right, before we get into some of the strategies, I think it's important to kind of understand the volunteer landscape. So I've got a few stats to share with you guys, and a lot of these are from our most recent annual member survey or annual adult education survey. So the first one is kind of looking at how we use volunteers. So when we think about volunteers, most of our literacy programs think about volunteers in terms of instructional volunteers. You'll see that only about 6% of our volunteer population are used in an administrative role, and then 9% are other roles. A lot of those are like board volunteers and then some other things. But you'll see, so about 15% non-instructional, 85% instructional. And we're going to come back to that because I think we're really underutilizing volunteers in ways to support the operations of our organizations. Kind of the age of paid and volunteer staff. So this is looking at our instructors. So you'll see these are kind of the numbers of volunteers and paid instructional staff that were reported on the survey. You'll see obviously not many under 15, few 16 to 18. I want to call your attention to kind of this 19 to 24 and 25 to 44. So that's kind of a big age group, but not a lot of volunteers are coming in from that age group. And you'll see that the vast majority of our volunteers in our literacy programs are 60 years old and older. And I heard somebody or saw somebody kind of putting in the chat the need to replenish volunteers, the need to recruit younger volunteers. And I think we need to do that for a couple of reasons. You know, we need to make sure we have kind of a regular cycle of volunteers coming in that are going to replace those folks that are retiring or retired and they've volunteered for a while, but then they want to get on with other aspects of that retirement. But also we know, not wanting to generalize, but we know for a lot of our older volunteers, they struggled during COVID when all of our tutoring moved on to kind of a virtual platform. And we know a lot of our programs are maintaining those virtual services, at least in part, even as they're coming back and meeting in person. So we have some real needs for digital skills, and we, just kind of generalizing, we know those younger folks are more likely to be kind of comfortable in a digital environment than the older folks. So we really need to kind of open up our younger pipeline. We'll talk a little bit about how to do that and why some of those folks may not be volunteering. And then the last piece of data, I'm going to ask you a question. I have a poll for you, and this is kind of how do volunteers learn about our programs? So, um, my question is, what do you think is the best volunteer referral source? And so you'll see there's a lot of choices. These were the choices that were in our survey. And I'm just going to ask you to complete that or just pick one, and then we'll see what you think and how it compares to the information that we got from our survey. All right, looks like almost everybody has participated. I'm going to take about maybe 30 more seconds. I think we're about to get close to full participation. Got 3 people left. All right, counting down. 5, 4, 3, 2. One person left. Come on. There we go. 100% participation. All right. Let's end the poll and share the results. So it looks like most people are pretty smart, you guys. They're family and friends you identified as kind of the best referral source. And it looks like that was followed by social media and then maybe either the website or the library. Well, you guys are actually right. This is what we learned from our survey, that most of the volunteer programs report that their best kind of source is family and friends, followed by the website, library, social media, special events. So we're going to talk about kind of how to take advantage of that. So I'm going to close this and go back to the chat. So let me just ask, or let me give you a little bit more kind of information about that. And this is from a study from the Volunteer Center of Ottawa Carleton. So not in the US, Canada, but I think it's still relevant. It's about volunteering in general, not volunteering in a literacy program. But what they found when they surveyed volunteers is they found that 40% became involved in their volunteer opportunity because someone asked them. Like, that is the biggest factor. Did someone ask me to volunteer? And if they did it. 25% learned about the volunteer opportunity from a relative or a friend, and less than 20% kind of sought out the volunteer activity on their own. So that idea of uh, having your current volunteers are your best kind of recruiting mechanism for new volunteers, and I think that has a lot of uh, 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 relevance for when we're thinking about answering some of these questions about how do I find new volunteers, how do I find young volunteers. We need to start, when we get those volunteers that represent the volunteers that we want, we need to figure out how to engage them in our recruiting efforts. So let me just ask this question. How many of you, or does anyone, have specific strategies that you use for incorporating your current volunteers into your recruitment efforts? And if you do, I'm going to ask you to just kind of type a sentence or two into the chat so we can hear a little bit about what those strategies are. So, and this is like an intentional, targeted approach to getting those volunteers involved. So interested to hear how you're doing that. Okay, so Kelly says, I asked them to join the volunteer training sessions for new volunteers. That's good. That's excellent. That is a group of people that you've already recruited, but can kind of address that issue of continuing their engagement and excitement and leading them to take an assignment as opposed to completing the training and leaving. Asking current volunteers for referrals. We've got prior to every tutor training class to ask people to invite a friend. Um, Accompany volunteers accompanying them to information sessions at local community centers. Oh, I like that. That's really good. Open houses, Fatima, that's great. We're going to talk a little bit about open houses because if you kind of go back, number 5 on that, how do volunteers learn about you, is special events. So open houses are a great way to kind of combine that referral process of family and friends and having a special event where people can come and learn more about you. And those can be open houses. They can just be, holiday parties, summer cookouts, things like that. Like every event doesn't have to be a big shindig. It can be just an informal gathering, a kind of simple social event, maybe participating in other things that go on in your community, St. Patrick's Day or things like that, or festivals and things like that that are going on. But they provide an opportunity for your current volunteers to invite their family and friends into that social environment and learn more about your organization. So I really like that idea. Um, let's see some of the other ones. So we've got, again, so this one, Denise, all of our 5 tutors are retired professor from Michigan Tech U. I think that's Michigan Tech U. Like to find some skilled people within the community too. But one of the things you can do also, you see kind of low on that list is employer referrals. But I think that might be because we're approaching the employers without also taking advantage of volunteers who might also work for that company or organization and involving them in that referral process. And I think if we can make those connections with companies through current volunteers, that process might be a lot stronger. Okay, great choices. I think as we publish a transcript of this chat, those are going to be great ideas that you can take back. Fantastic. All right. I want to talk a little bit about what motivates a volunteer. And again, this is not just related to literacy. It's more kind of the broader scope of volunteering. And it's a combination of a few different studies. But again, I think it's relevant in our case for helping us do a better job of recruiting and especially the messaging that we have around the recruiting of volunteers. So the first one, people volunteer because they have values or belief in the cause. I feel it's important to help others be able to read, write, speak English, become citizens, get their GED, read to their child. All of those things that we know that learning to read can help people do. And I feel like most of our literacy programs, in terms of messaging, we really do a good job about that message. Really good at connecting people, trying to connect with people's commitment to our mission. The second one, which I think we also do a pretty good job with, is that personal. So when people know someone who benefits from an organization, people know someone who has trouble reading, had trouble reading. A lot of times you'll hear volunteers talk about their parents or family members that didn't get their GED, had trouble reading, were immigrants, didn't become citizens, had trouble learning English. So they're doing volunteer work because they have that very personal connection. It's the remaining ones that I think when we think about recruiting volunteers, we don't necessarily do a good job of, in our messaging, reflecting these other reasons why you might want to volunteer. So understanding, just learning about literacy and how folks, wind up going through the education system and not being able to read. What are those kind of factors that contribute to that? Getting an understanding of the levels of support and kind of the barriers that adults face in terms of learning to read and the supports that are necessary. So really getting a deeper understanding of that issue through volunteering. Feeling better about yourself. That's why a lot of people volunteer. They want to feel good about themselves. It's not necessarily connecting to the cause. We can do, more messaging around how good it makes volunteers feel. They may want to get started in a career in adult education or education in general. Or we talked about how little we use those other kind of non-instructional volunteers, but maybe somebody wants to work on their the communication or marketing or their digital skills. They website building, things like that. Fundraising. They want to get into fundraising, and your organization is a great way to kind of start doing that. So looking at those career opportunities, people that might want to volunteer to.
Or maybe we make sure we have lots of events for people to connect with other people if they're going to be kind of meeting out in libraries away from people. And then the last one, and I think this is a really important one to understand, and I think one that we don't think about at all. But volunteering is a way for people to escape from, it says, from my own troubles. But really, like if you have like a high pressure job, or you just have like a lot of stuff going on, coming and volunteering and being with a group of people, working with a student and just having like something to focus on, that can be a great tension reliever. It can be a great mechanism of escape for somebody. And so I think as you go back and look at your messaging that you're using when you're recruiting volunteers, one of the things I would encourage you to do is go through and look at, do I have messaging for those people that want to volunteer to work on some of their career goals? Or do I have recruitment messaging for people that just want to meet other people or want to feel better about themselves? And if you don't, think about how you might add that. So, all right. So that's going to bring us to kind of our first strategy, which is if we want to do a better job of recruiting volunteers, it's important for us to understand why people volunteer. So that starts with our recruiting messages need to address all the reasons someone might want to volunteer, not just being focused on our cause and the value of learning to read or write or speak English. It means that when a volunteer comes into our organization, we need to ask that volunteer why they're volunteering, why they chose us, and what they want to get out of that volunteer opportunity. If we don't ask those questions and track that and check in on that, then we're not going to have happy volunteers. And if we don't have happy volunteers, when we look at our kind of largest referral service of friends and family, if those volunteers are happy because the reason that they came into our organization matches what they're doing, they're going to tell all their friends and family. If it doesn't, if their experience is not great, then they're not going to tell their friends and family, and we're really missing out. So we need to make sure that we understand why somebody is coming in, and then we need to make sure that the volunteer opportunity that we assign them to matches their reason for volunteering. After we do that, we need to not constantly, but on a regular basis, go back and check in with that volunteer and recognize and reinforce their reason for volunteering, and making sure that we're hitting the mark. And if we're not, we need to make adjustments to that. All right. Does that make sense to folks? All right. That other piece of using current volunteers to recruit, we need to have, I think, an active plan of how we're going to do that. So what does that look like? First of all, that looks like we just need to make sure that volunteers understand the role they play. So we need to make sure that when we're doing our volunteer training, and this is for instructional volunteers or for those administrative volunteers, we need to make sure that they understand that our biggest source of volunteers is them. And we need to talk to them about ways that they can help us do that by inviting friends, by sharing things on social media, stuff like that. Which brings us to the second one. Have easy strategies for volunteers to recruit. So make sure that volunteers know that you have a Facebook page, an Instagram page, that you are regularly encouraging them to follow you, share things, share tweets, things like that. In doing that, make sure you're posting, not just stats about literacy and stuff like that, but make sure you're posting pictures of them, pictures of your volunteers doing things, having fun, that you're kind of giving personal messages that are really an encouragement for them to then share and spread. Another thing that's really easy is make sure your volunteers get swag. Have t-shirts, coffee mugs, caps, things like that your volunteers can have visible, wear about, and are possibly able to spark conversations about what is that organization? Tell me a little bit more about it. So just some of these easy things that allow volunteers to promote, as well as asking your volunteers to come and speak at engagements and things. Hosting special events. We were just talking about that. I forget the person's name. I think it was Fatima that talked about hosting open houses. But yes, hosting special events, and they can be big, they can be small, but the biggest thing is they're things that your volunteers want to come to, and they're things that they can bring their family and friends to. And in doing that, that increases your opportunity to get more of their network into your organization as volunteers. And then the next one was connect to volunteers, companies, and organizations. Okay. All right. So our first couple of strategies around using current volunteers and just making sure that we understand why people are volunteering with us. Now I want to talk a little bit about why don't people volunteer? Okay. This is from another study. This is a national survey of giving, volunteering, and participating. So again, not literacy specific, but around volunteering in general. But I think that it has, it can inform what we do. Okay. So look at that first one. The biggest reason why people don't volunteer. 69% said they don't have any extra time. All right. Now, if you go back and you look at, and this is to remind you of what that stat was, you look at that kind of big group of people between 19 and 44 age group, those two columns in the middle, and you see how few of them are actually volunteering with our organizations. Now that's a 29, 39, that's about a 25-year group of people, but they represent a small percentage of our volunteers. Why is that? You think about who those folks are. They are, generally speaking, These are folks that have jobs. A lot of them are kind of entering into their professional careers. They're getting married, they're starting families, and they don't really see where they have time to volunteer. So if we want to, somebody talked about, I need to get that pipeline of younger volunteers. So if you need to get that pipeline of younger volunteers, we need to figure out ways to have volunteer opportunities that are easy for them to access. Okay. And we'll talk a little bit about how we might structure some of our volunteer opportunities to make that a little bit easier for them a little bit later in the presentation. But I think kind of recognizing who those younger people are and why they don't volunteer. A second one, unwilling to make a year-round commitment. This is a commitment that we traditionally ask volunteers so that students will have kind of consistency in their instruction, but it's a barrier for a lot of people. And so we need to really think about why we're doing that, and are there some ways that we can, again, structure our volunteer opportunities so that that's not a barrier. And we'll talk about some strategies for that a little bit later. Giving money instead of time. Ideally, we would like for people to give us money and time. But if people are giving us money, a lot of times we're going to be okay with that, right? If you say, we really, really, really need you to volunteer, maybe they give you more money instead of volunteering. That's okay too. So we'll leave that one alone. But the last one I think is really important as well is no one personally asked. And this was a big reason for everyone, but it was especially big among African American and Hispanic people. And I think this is really important when we go back to that idea of wanting a more diverse volunteer workforce in our organization. We have to really think about where we're going and who we're utilizing and making those asks. Are we going out into communities that represent the diversified population that we want in our organization? Are we going into those communities and asking people? Are we identifying the people that are already representing those communities that are volunteering in our organization and really engaging them to be part of our recruitment efforts? All right. So when we think about diversity, we need to combine that with what we know about why people volunteer, our biggest sources of volunteering, which is family and friends, and why people don't volunteer is because no one personally asked. So we need to make sure that we have a really active strategy of asking those folks. Okay, I'm going to stop here and just pause a minute and give folks an opportunity. Oh, thank you, Michelle. I'm going to ask people if they have kind of any comments. Melody, you have your hand up, so I'm going to open your microphone and let you talk. You should be able to unmute.
I accidentally hit that. My bar went down where I was trying to look at things. I don't have a comment right
You
now.
don't have a comment. Okay.
Good information though so far.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna put you back into the group then. All right. So if anybody has any kind of questions or comments, why don't you go ahead and kind of post those into the chat before we move forward. And I'll give folks a couple of minutes to do that. And it looks like we have a question in the Q&A. Melody, actually, great question in the Q&A. Should we formally evaluate tutors on an ongoing basis? Yes, I think so. We should definitely evaluate. We should evaluate, again, kind of both their performance, because we want to make sure that volunteers or tutors are doing a good job. And if they're not, we want to figure out why that is. And the biggest thing is we want to go off of the assumption that people are volunteering their free time because they want to do this for one reason or another. And so if they're not being successful, we need to figure out why that is and provide them with the supports that are necessary. So maybe they need more support, maybe they need more training, maybe they're not in the right volunteer opportunity for them. So I think that is kind of important to do, but I think it's also important to evaluate on a regular basis, are people enjoying their volunteer opportunity? And that can be formal. You can send out surveys to people, but it can also be informal. Even if you have people out meeting out in libraries and things like that, I would encourage you, if you're doing that, once every couple of months, just schedule a week where you're going to be at that library during certain periods of the day so that you can check in with tutors and students to see how things are going and having a conversation with that volunteer and just make sure they're happy and engaged. Let's see.
Todd, we have a follow-up question from Louisa. What are some things about the tutors that we should be attentive to, and what are some ways to go about this? I assume she's talking about evaluation. And then when you're done with that, we have a hand raised from Susan.
Okay, perfect. So Louisa, I think some things to kind of ask about or be attentive to with volunteers. In terms of recruitment and retaining of volunteers, so not kind of evaluating their effectiveness in actually tutoring a student, but looking at that recruitment and retention piece, I would just ask, first of all, if I would just have conversations, try to have conversations with my volunteers. One of the things when I worked at a local program in Memphis, we migrated a lot of our instruction to a center. And one of the benefits of that was in the daytime and at nighttime, we had kind of a regular schedule. And volunteers would come early, they would get a cup of coffee, they would sit down at this kind of middle table that we would have. And we as staff always used that as an opportunity to just have a conversation with them and check in and see how things are going. So I would encourage you to kind of look for opportunities to just have conversations with folks and then be able to capture that information. But it needs to be tied to kind of going back to that initial thing of recognizing and remembering why people volunteered and just kind of find out, are they meeting that? Maybe they weren't meeting that desire to like have social connection, but they realized, you know what, I'm getting something else out of this, and kind of checking in and making sure that's good and they're enjoying that. And then you can figure out how to highlight that. But I think it's really around just those conversations. But the biggest thing is really at getting, and it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Why did you come in? And are we meeting that? Are you doing that? And then you said we had somebody that had their hand. Yeah.
Yep,
Susan.
Susan,
Okay.
I've allowed you to talk.
Perfect.
Can you speak?
I think she still needs to unmute herself.
Susan, can you unmute yourself?
I thought
There we go.
sorry.
There you go.
Okay, I'm Susan Leffler with the Literacy Volunteers of Kanawha County, West Virginia. We tutor one-on-one, and we only use volunteers as tutors. I have had no luck with younger volunteer tutors. Often they will go through the training and then never take an assignment. We had one woman who, unbeknownst to me, signed up for the training right before she was about to have her fifth child. And when I assigned her a student, never got a hold of the student. I finally got a hold of her, and she said, "Oh, I just got out of the hospital. It was a difficult pregnancy. I don't think I can tutor." And of course, I'm thinking, why in the world did you sign up then? But often we will have younger tutors who will tutor for a month or two, and then life gets in the way. But often they just disappear. They don't tell me they're leaving. They just leave the students high and dry. They don't answer emails. They don't answer phone calls. I regularly check up on all my tutors with phone calls. And these folks, most of them don't even return phone calls or answer emails. And I've really given up on younger tutors, which is kind of a shame.
So,
Can I ask a question, a follow-up question, Susan, before you jump in, Todd? Where
Sure.
were you recruiting these younger tutors from? I'm just curious. Was there a specific outlet you were recruiting from?
Most of our tutors, we always ask tutors, how did you hear about us? And the vast majority, about 90% of our tutors, come from paid newspaper ads. The rest of them usually come from our website. Often the younger ones come from the website.
Mhm.
The older ones generally come from the newspaper ads.
And how long is the period between when they first contact you and you sort of go through a screening and get them trained before they're matched?
It totally depends. If we do trainings, free trainings 3 times a year, if they contact us, it could be another 3, 4 months, depending when they contact us. If they're answering an ad, we run the ads for like 2 weeks before the training. So it's quick.
Okay, that's one of the, Todd, you're welcome to follow up. I just asked because I wondered if the kind of gap between that initial interest, which, as you said, if they contacted you and a training wasn't coming right away, it could be months, and sometimes people change their minds. So, Todd, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, actually, I do. And what I want to do is kind of use Susan's experiences as a transition for the next things that we're going to talk about. But Susan, what I would fundamentally say is that maybe you want to rethink how you're utilizing those younger volunteers. If you find that they are busy, that they don't have time to commit, especially if they're, I mean, asking somebody to be interested in something and then wait a couple of months before they get trained and can kind of get started. The, you know, the desire, the passion is, there's a good chance that's going to go away. So I think kind of we're going to talk about some strategies for rethinking and constructing volunteer opportunities, both instructional and non-instructional, different ways that you can kind of think about doing those so that it can accommodate people, get them into your program quicker, accommodate people that want to volunteer for a shorter period of time, those sorts of things. So, Susan, I'm going to hold on to the things that you said. And as we go through those next kind of elements, I'm going to come back to them. There's some great comments in the chat. And then we have one question in the Q&A about going back to strategy 1. And so I'm going to do that real quick so you can see strategy 1. So somebody asked what was the last bullet, the last point. So make sure volunteer opportunity matches the reason for volunteering. And then we want to basically go back and check in. So if we put them in a volunteer opportunity that we think matches why they came in, we want to go back and on a regular basis make sure we were thinking about that correctly. We put them in a good place. And if we didn't, we want to get them out of that volunteer opportunity and into another one as quickly as possible. And we want to do that so that people remain happy, so that they become a good referral source for other volunteers. So hopefully that took care of that. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to why people don't volunteer. All right, so I think we have in our organizations created a lot of barriers to volunteering. I have an idea of what I think those barriers are. I'm going to ask you to put in the chat things that you think are barriers in your program to people volunteering. And yes, you'll receive a copy of the slides, Karen Lee. So just put down in the chat some of the things that you think are barriers to people volunteering. And actually, Susan gave us some good examples. Lack of compensation. And Sarah, you might have been the person that commented earlier that you were competing with people that were paying their volunteers. Large time commitment, lack of ongoing support. Let's see, wait time for training, being paired with, or the wait time for being paired with a student, the length of the training, time commitment, lack of touching base with all volunteers on a regular basis. Online training, it's hard for people who aren't tech savvy. Winter weather, the distance they live from volunteer locations. Okay, that's a good one. That's a good one. That's a barrier very similar to barriers that our students have with attending class, right? So geography, it's really kind of one of the things that if you can do virtual instruction can solve that. Overcommitment and time constraints. Lack of a permanent building or meeting space. Use local church, now online. Library and town requirements. Okay. Not enough time for bonding. Okay, good. I think all of these are good. Here are some of the barriers that I kind of have identified. And if you think back about some of those reasons why people don't volunteer, so that year commitment, I think, is a big one. You're asking people to commit to a meeting twice a week, every week for 1 year. I mean, that's a lot. And especially if you're doing one-on-one tutoring, you're kind of solely responsible for that student getting regular instruction. Meeting twice a week, that means you're going to have a hard time taking vacation, taking breaks for holidays, especially if you're a young person. If you're a college student, you've got kind of time when midterms and finals are coming up, when college is out and you might go home to your family. If you're a retired person living in the north, you might want to you might be a snowbird where you're going to, Florida or Texas or Arizona in the wintertime, and you can't do that anymore. So that commitment, I think, is a big one, not just because of time, but when you combine that with the idea of one-on-one tutoring, it is a barrier because of the social aspect. When people are volunteering because they want a social connection, you're pairing them up with one other person. That's their only social connection, and it can be a lot of pressure. That 15 hours of plus of pre-service training, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's a lot of time to ask somebody to invest before they start doing the thing that they want to do. I always think back about when I was trying to learn to play guitar. First person I took lessons from, they spent a lot of time teaching me how to read sheet music and play scales and a lot of music theory. And I quit because it was boring and it wasn't what I wanted to do. My second guitar teacher understood that what I fundamentally wanted to do was play guitar and kind of around my friends and have them sing. I had other friends that played musical instruments, and I just wanted to be able to play well enough to participate. So he focused on teaching me enough chords that I could play songs that were popular that my friends would know. And I was playing a song within like a month. And that made me feel successful. It encouraged me and what made me wanted to continue. And then he kind of added additional music theory and skills and stuff like that as we went along. But I think that pre-service training, having it so big, is it's another barrier. That meeting out in libraries can make people feel isolated. This focus on instructional volunteers as opposed to and not focusing on administrative or other volunteers, I think is a big one, because not everybody wants to be a tutor or a teacher. And sometimes I think about that. People get locked into this counting or reporting mindset. And what I mean by that is I have folks that I work with here in St. Louis where we talked about using administrative volunteers. And their first comment about that was, well, I don't get paid for administrative volunteers. I get paid for instructional volunteers. And I thought, well, you're kind of focused on the wrong thing. And I understand the need to get paid. But really the question should be is, if you had somebody else doing this administrative job, would that be helpful to you? And if the answer is yes, then it doesn't matter if you're getting paid for that volunteer or not. If their volunteering in that role would help you, put volunteers in that role. So just kind of thinking about some of those mindsets and some of those structures that we've created. Now I'm going to talk about kind of a strategy for approaching that can kind of break down some of those. So team volunteering, right? And what I mean by that is instead of thinking about every instructional position, every administrative position as being one position, one job, one person, is think of it as being one position, one job, multiple people, a team of people. And where the benefits of that come in is this: when you have 3 or 5 volunteers doing a job instead of just one, it provides some consistency in the delivery of services. So if a volunteer drops out, leaves, it doesn't leave a student or a job or other people high and dry, because you've got a still remaining team to continue to do that work. It accommodates unreliable schedules. So those things that we were talking about college students who may need to take time out for finals and traveling home, people that want to take travel during the summer. It accommodates those unreliable schedules because you still have a team of volunteers. If somebody's going to be out for a couple of months, you still have a group of people that can do that job. It shortens the formal training requirements because you can do some shorter initial training and then rely on that existing team. You bring a new person into that volunteer role, they can do, you can take advantage of a lot of on-the-job training and mentoring to fill in that those training needs. So it gets people started sooner without that kind of big chunk of training before you ever do something. Think back about the story about me learning to play guitar. It eases the responsibility of volunteers. You're not the only person responsible for delivering that instruction or delivering that service. Creates opportunities for social engagement, and it promotes long-term volunteering. I'm going to come back to that long-term volunteering when I talk about this team approach. I'm going to give you 2 examples. One's going to be instructional and one's going to be administrative. And I'm going to come back to that long-term volunteering piece, especially around that administrative piece. So Kathy is saying that this approach has worked well for some of their New York State programs. I'm glad to hear that, Kathy. And then Karen says something about digital literacy is always useful. So Karen, that's actually an excellent point related to the team volunteering. Is it allows you to assemble a team of people that have different skills. So everybody doesn't need to be a technical whiz or comfortable with digital tools, as long as one person is or a couple of people are and they can support the others. So it kind of overcomes some of those fears as well. All right. So my first example was in Memphis. Now, this was a while back, but we added small group instruction to our traditional one-on-one tutoring. And what we did is we set up these reading groups and vocabulary and writing, and they were roughly 15 students and 3 tutors. And the 3 tutors shared responsibility for instruction. So the classes were like 2 hours long. So they sat down every week and they had kind of a plan for the next week's lesson and who was going to present on what. And the nice thing was is while one person was presenting, the other 2 could kind of wander around. If a student needed some extra support or additional kind of instruction, those other 2 tutors could provide that. If people had if something came up during the week and one person had to miss, those students enrolled in that class still came to class and still got instruction. So they were able to maintain the consistency in their attendance because you still had 2 people that were there to teach. It also addressed that uncertain yearly schedule. So college students were now able to take tutoring assignments because when they had finals coming up, they could say, you know what, the next couple of weeks are going to be rough for me. Tax attorneys who, during April, they were like, I'm not going to be able to be here. There were 2 other people that were there and able to deliver instruction. And when their workload lightened up or their travel lightened up, they could come back in. Again, it kind of shortened the training process because we were able to combine it with mentoring and kind of on-the-job training. And we worked with those tutors on having a very structured approach for when a new person came on about, they had really, each class had kind of thought out like, what are the best ways to get someone started? What are the easiest things for them to start on? How are we going to build their skills? What questions are they likely to have? And how are we going to address those? So there was kind of this ongoing continuous training and support as opposed to front loading it before a tutor has even met with a student and then kind of hoping that they remember everything that you talked about. And then the last one that engaged tutors socially. So that's one example on the instructional side. And then now I have a question for you. So this is a Mentimeter. So you can either scan the QR code, or if you're on a laptop, you can go to menti.com and use that code. But I want you to type in your responses, and you can put 3 responses in. It's going to give us a word cloud. If you had unlimited resources, unlimited capacity at your literacy program to hire staff, who would you hire? And I'm not looking for like Martha. I'm looking for, I would hire a fund developer, or I would hire a student support person, things like that. So what would be those positions? Do I have another okay button? I do. Thank you, Michelle. Okay, don't put it in the chat. Use the website or the QR code to go to the Mentimeter and put it in there so that we can see those things pop up. Thank you, whoever did that first. Retired teachers, okay? And what would you hire those retired teachers to do? So you would hire more teachers, maybe, okay? A volunteer coordinator, grant writer, factory supervisor, student coordinator. So not who background, but what role would they have in your literacy program? So you're hiring staff for your literacy program. All right, we've got instructors, we've got data input, okay. Lots of instructors, fundraisers, capacity builders, advocacy people, a translator. This is great. Outreach director. Fantastic. Now, big ones there are volunteer coordinators and grant writers, a literacy assistant. Fantastic. Okay, So what I'm going to propose to you is that you can use volunteers, all of those things that you just identified, you can use volunteers to do those things. And I know a lot of times we're reluctant to do that because it takes a lot of time. Every time we put a volunteer in one of those staffing roles, it takes a lot of time to train that person and get them going. And then they might leave and then you're stuck. But if you also think about performing those roles with teams, then that gearing up and getting that started with volunteers, it only takes a long time once, because then after that, new volunteers are coming into an existing system. And so I'll give you an example. And then I just wanted to remind you of like all of those things that you guys said that you could use. And we're really only using volunteers outside of instruction, about 15% of our volunteers outside of instruction. So we can really use more volunteers to perform these functions. All right, so again, in Memphis, as we moved to a center, we realized that all of our staff was working during the day, and we needed to have a center that was open in the evening, because a lot of our students worked during the day. They came to class or had their tutoring sessions at night. But we didn't have the staff to open it up at night and like have a full staff. So we said, what we're going to do is we're going to schedule our staff so that every staff person works one night a week, and we have one or two staff people that time. And we're going to recruit a cadre of administrative volunteers to basically work as office personnel in the daytime and the evening to round out our office staff. All right. And so we recruited them from a variety of backgrounds, including former tutors. And former tutors, we were really successful in getting tutors that had been tutors, they had stopped meeting with their student. They had become disengaged from our organization. When we called them up and talked to them about this volunteer opportunity, we got so many of them back involved. And I think because as you look at the job duties, they were so varied that they weren't, they were significant, and they were meaningfully connected to our work. They weren't just, I don't want to make light of it, but the volunteers didn't view it as busy work. And so part of their job duties, and it was, again, 3 to 5 office volunteers, a different group every day and every evening, but they answered the phone. One of the biggest things they did is they did all of our student intake and initial assessment. And it really allowed us to develop a lot more consistency in the assessments that we were doing with students, because the same people were doing them over and over and over again. And so the student would come in, they would get all of that information, they would do the assessment, they would walk the student around the campus and kind of show them the classes, show them the computer lab, pop into the library that we had there, peek in and eavesdrop on people doing one-on-one instruction. And so the students really got a good sense of what they were enrolling in. They called volunteers for our monthly reports, which not only helped us get data, which we had a hard time getting our volunteers. I suspect this is not uncommon. We had a hard time getting volunteers to send in those monthly reports with their hours. But they also, in calling up those volunteers for their monthly reports, had an opportunity to talk to that volunteer. And if that volunteer had questions or things were going on with their student that they didn't know kind of how to address, this is what's happening with the student I'm working with. He's really having trouble kind of endings, kind of just understanding how endings on words work. Those volunteers were able to either recommend resources and strategies right there, or they would leave a note for our student support person, and the student support person would call that volunteer tutor back, or they would leave instructions for the office personnel, and that office personnel person would call them back. But that personal contact with the volunteers, not only did it get our data in, but it also strengthened the connection of those tutors with our organization because they were getting personal attention every month. They did a lot of substitute tutoring when a tutor couldn't show up, something happened. They didn't have to cancel with the student. One of the office staff would do that lesson. They would talk to the tutor, the student's regular tutor, find out where they were, find out any things they needed to pay attention to, and they would go in and do that. And then they did other projects that came up. And this team approach, one of the kind of common things that happened for us is we had never had good success, kind of like what Susan was talking about. We had not had good success. We had tried to recruit college students because we had a lot of colleges in Memphis, had not had success with them sticking with us for a long time. But once we started this team approach, both instructionally and especially with these administrative volunteers, we had volunteers that volunteered with us for 4 or 5 years, the entire time that they were at the colleges. So that team approach really improved our retention of volunteers because it gave some flexibility to people. So I'm going to stop here and just see if people want to post some comments. We heard from Kathy who said their folks had had some success. Christine says this team approach sounds like it would help younger volunteers. I think it does, Christine. And I think when you go back and think about those 19 to 44 age groups, those 2 age groups, and that idea that people don't volunteer because they don't have time, this team approach really lessens that burden. Because if things are coming up and you can't make it that week, it's okay because there are other people to kind of take up the slack. Heather says this team paradigm is mind-blowing for me. I hope that means in a good way. You hadn't thought about that before. Yes, Heather says. Good. Heather, I'm glad you're thinking about that this has kind of opened up your eyes. And I think, yeah, we often just think about one job, one person. But this team approach is really, really good. Fatima, sounds brilliant. I would love to take just sole credit for the brilliance of it, but actually we kind of stumbled on it really, just because one of there were 2 volunteers that had, kind of were friends and they wanted to start a new class and they were like, can we start this new class together? So we had started, when we started doing kind of classes at the center, we had started with a 1 tutor per class approach. And then we saw how well this team was working, and specifically the fact that when one of them couldn't make it, the other one was still there. And we thought, well, why aren't we just doing this? And yeah, it really worked. It really worked well. Okay. Okay, so here's a good question from Rita. Do most literacy members operate out of a designated room at a library, or how many don't have a room to operate out of? So I'm going to let folks respond to Rita's question. If your folks meet at a library, just kind of indicate if they have a special place, a designated room or a designated area where they meet, or they don't. Because I think it's a good question, Rita. And one of the things I would say, even if your program is a one-on-one only tutoring program, think about maybe creating like a buddy system where you always kind of make sure that 2 tutor-student pairs are kind of meeting out at the library at the same time. And even if they're working with their individual tutor and student separately, maybe you encourage people to do like a 5-minute kind of warm-up activity and a 5-minute closing activity that they do as a foursome. just to, again, kind of build that social connection, that opportunity for support. And then if one of the tutors can't make it, maybe that student that's kind of would normally be hung out to dry can kind of pair up with the other tutor-student pair. But I think it really, in answer, going back to your question, Rita, I think it kind of varies. I think it's going to kind of vary. And I think, we're seeing that a lot of folks, it looks like, have designated rooms in a quiet corner. And then some people kind of pick a table. It all depends. Okay. Thank you guys for answering Rita's question. I think that's really, really helpful. Okay. Got a couple of more strategies, and then we're going to stop and we're going to answer some more questions. So another way, another strategy I want to encourage you to kind of think about, and it's along this same line of like team tutoring, is thinking about, are there ways that I can establish kind of short-term or drop-in instructional opportunities? And this goes back to kind of another point that Susan made about folks, maybe they're not able to commit a year. Maybe they're not even able to commit 6 months, but they've got 3 months that they can really do some instructional work or some volunteer work. Think about how we can take advantage of that. So some of those things are establishing kind of labs. So like computer labs or tutoring labs, where you have like a bank of computers with learning software. The student is fundamentally on there learning on their own, but you have some volunteers there for when the student has questions. Maybe they need support on the technology, or maybe there's some kind of instructional thing they're not understanding, and there's somebody there to kind of help them through it. If you have somebody that's going to be kind of a short-term volunteer, you can train them, put them in that lab, provide some support, and then when they leave, no harm done, because there's other people still there supporting the lab. So it's kind of that team model. Some other things is really establishing some, I'd say, like a conversation class or survival vocabulary class. These are around kind of English language learners. So they can be shorter classes. So a conversation class might be something that you offer year round, but you offer it in kind of 6-week intervals, right? And then you take a couple of weeks off, and then you come back for the conversation class. And let's say it's organized around a topic, and you just kind of say, during this 6 weeks, this is what we're going to be talking about. And those types of classes are less informal, but they're good opportunities, especially for English language learners, to practice their oral language skills. And again, doesn't require necessarily as much training. If you're doing it, kind of taking a team approach, it's a way to put somebody in there, and they can do it even if they have a short-term volunteer opportunity. Another good use for these is if somebody is in between assignments. So I've been working with a student, that student has moved on, and I'm waiting for another assignment. I don't want to sit around for 3 months while you find me another match. Maybe I can help in the computer lab or help with a conversation class, that sort of thing. Book clubs. The last one is learning circles. So Bronwyn says, we've had several short-term virtual classes making use of News for You Online. Call it current events. That's a great example, Bronwyn. I think that's the kind of thing we're talking about. Yeah, that's great. Learning circles is another one. And what learning circles are is kind of that idea of a short-term class, usually around a specific topic. But the real difference here is that the learning is provided by a digital tool. So everybody's kind of coming at a regular time, either virtually or meeting in person, but maybe you're all taking an online class together. So the instructions actually being provided by an online tool like NGen or New Readers Press Online or something like that. But you have a volunteer or a couple of volunteers there that are working as facilitators. So their role is to kind of give assignments within that digital tool. So right now we're going to work on reading this and answering, the next 5 questions. And then we're going to stop. We're going to have a discussion. And so they facilitate that discussion, and then students go back and work on that tool. So again, because the instruction's being provided by that digital tool, you don't have to have as much training, but the tutor can still come in and have a role in instruction, and it's supporting the learning of the students, and it can be like a tight, shorter time commitment. And also because they're facilitating, less training that they need. So kind of thinking about some of those short-term or drop-in instruction opportunities, they not only accommodate different schedules, but they also accommodate kind of shorter time periods, and they help you keep tutors engaged in between assignments. All right. Last thing I want to talk about, and then we're going to kind of sum up and then open up for questions, is really thinking about that 15 hours of tutor training. And honestly, I've been trying to get folks to rethink their training process since I started with Laubach Literacy back in 1996. But we just have kind of this historical idea that, learning to read and write and speak English is complicated. There are, graduate level degrees around this stuff. So we feel compelled to kind of give tutors as much information as we think they could possibly need before they start working with a student, because we want them to be well prepared. But the kind of crazy thing about that is, if you think about what we know about adult learning theory, good adult learning, we know that adults learn best when what they're learning is relevant to what they're doing in the real world, that they learn by doing. They need to be able to apply what they're learning to real tasks, that adults learn better when anybody really learns better when there's small, easily digestible chunks that give us a chance to kind of get that information, use that information, feel confident in our ability to understand that information before we move forward. And we know good adult learning is guided and scaffolded, where we have appropriate levels of support, modeling, and then we kind of gradually move that support away as we see that the person we're working with, has a better feel or understanding with what they're doing. All right. So that's what we know about adult learning theory. It's the kind of things we talk about in that 15-hour tutor training, when we're talking about how tutors want to approach instruction with the students that they're working with. But then we look at our kind of traditional 15-hour training. So first of all, we're training tutors before they've ever met with a student. So it's not relevant to what they're doing in the real world, because they've never spoken to an adult literacy or English language student. They don't get an opportunity to learn by doing, because they're not with a student already. So you're teaching them how to teach vocabulary, but then there's no opportunity to then go meet with a student and actually try out that strategy. And it might be another 2-3 weeks when they get done with that tutor training before they meet with that student. And it might actually be 3 months from now before they realize, oh, here's a vocabulary word that student doesn't know. Let me try to remember the vocabulary strategies that I learned 3 months ago that I didn't get a chance to apply, and also learned in the context of also learning about adult learning theory and teaching phonics and decoding, sight words, fluency, reading comprehension, skills and strategy, how to identify main idea in detail, and teaching grammar and writing process. It's just, there's no way That's certainly not 15 hours of instruction is not small, easily digestible chunks. Worked one time with a consultant when I was in Memphis. He was working with us on revising our mission statement and our values for our organization. And he told us, because we had a list of values that were like 8, 10 values long. And he told us, I want you to reduce those to 3. And we said, why 3? And he said, because people can't remember more than 3 things. And if you can't remember your values, then they're no good to you. I kind of feel like we should take the same approach with training. So if we cram 15 out, cram a lot of information in 15 hours, that's way more than people are going to remember. And there's no guarantee that they're going to remember it correctly. So really kind of shortening that training into small digestible pieces that give people a chance to use it and apply it before we ask them to learn something else, I think is a better approach. And so kind of thinking about how we might do that, looking at some just-in-time training, on-the-job training, observation and mentoring, online training. And the benefits of online training is that when you do that, I just talked about the volunteer. It might be 3 months into meeting with a student before they're like, oh, I need that vocabulary teaching strategy. Well, if you're doing it online, they can go back into that online module and find that. If you're doing it live, then you can't go back into your training that happened 3 months ago and take it again. So just kind of thinking about what are some ways that we can structure our tutor training to maybe not be a barrier for folks and be better in the process. And thinking just kind of maybe combining that with a scripted approach for the first couple of months of instruction where a tutor really needs a lot of support, kind of thinking about that scaffolded piece of here's the things you're going to do over the first couple of months. And then after that, you will have had some observations with working with the student, understanding what they're having the most trouble with. And then we can come back and we can start to train you on those strategies that you're going to be able to utilize right away. So I see a lot of folks that have been commenting on this piece. So again, just kind of want to encourage you. And remember, that was a barrier that people identified with that 15 hours or that kind of long pre-conference or tutoring, a pre-assignment tutor training before you actually get started doing the thing that you want to do. All right. So I've talked a lot about things. So I want to kind of say, so we've talked about a lot of things, and I want to encourage you again to sign up for those discussion groups, because if any of these ideas interested you, then the discussion groups is where we're going to be able to have a conversation and talk more about how to implement them in your particular program. But just to sum up, we made it sound kind of complicated, but it's really pretty easy. We just need to focus on these 5 things. We need to understand why people volunteer. We need to create places that accommodate everyone. So places for everyone to volunteer, regardless of your motivation, kind of the circumstances of your life. Like are you busy? You have a short time to volunteer. You have a longer time to volunteer, but you have a unreliable schedule. You go on vacations during the summer. All of those things. We need to create places that accommodate all of those things and not be kind of so strict and so narrow in, we require these things if you're going to volunteer. And if you can't do those things, we don't have a place for you. So think about how we can open those up. We need to make it easier for people to volunteer to get started is really what I'm talking about there. So we need to create places, and then we need to get them into those places in an easy way, in a quick way. We need to keep volunteers engaged, happy. So we need to check in on them. We need to make sure they're supported. And then the last thing is, if we're doing those first 4 things, then we're going to have happy volunteers like the woman you see in the picture. And we need to take advantage of her and use her to recruit more folks just like her. So, all right. So I'm going to stop here and just invite folks to, if you have questions, to type those into the Q&A window, or if you would prefer, you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you and kind of let you ask your question that way. All right, so Susan has said we've started training on Zoom during COVID, continued to one-day Zoom, also encouraging tutors to take advantage of your Teacher Training Plus series. Perfect. That's a great example, Susan, of really kind of reducing that and taking advantage of, there's a lot of training and resources for volunteers out there to help them. And so I'd also encourage you to think about your training, not just as the formal training that you do, but when you think about training and supporting your volunteers, you have a lot of tools at your disposal. It's not just the training that you do, it's the, as Susan says, the webinars and things like that that we offer. It's also videos on YouTube that are demonstration videos. It is your newsletter. It is setting up support groups that meet monthly or quarterly and a small group of tutors. It is kind of using your monthly reports to identify tutors that are having similar issues with the students that they're working with, and maybe putting together a group that's going to do some investigation and some testing of strategies to see what works best. But there's all kinds of different ways to think about training and supporting tutors. It doesn't have to all happen in that time before somebody gets started working with a student. Christine asked, will we get a certificate and a recording of this webinar? I believe that's a yes and a yes. Michelle's reminding us that we're going to send out the slide deck and the recording. Let's see. I'll go back and look at some of these other comments. Kathy says that Kathy, you're like kind of a model program. I might have to recruit you to do some of this small group discussion stuff. But Kathy is saying that they also do kind of the scripting of their lesson plans for the first kind of few lessons that their tutors do. Great. It matches the strategies that they learn in training. Somebody said they've been selling the Conversation Club for new volunteers. I think that's excellent. It's also a good way, those kind of smaller volunteer opportunities, those short-term or drop-in. If you get the feeling that somebody might not be sure if they want to volunteer or not, or they want to be a tutor or not, dropping them into that where you know it's kind of a short-term commitment, where there's other people that they can work with and provide support and encouragement, and make like a social connection with them, is a good way to kind of let them feel it out, but also have somebody there that can really kind of hook them into the whole process. So I think there's some real good value there. All right, we are, I think, done early. So I'm going to stop here. Michelle, is there any problem with ending a little bit early?
No, as long as everybody has got their questions answered, I'd give everybody a last shot for questions or comments.
Yeah, I absolutely will do that. And I will be happy to, I think I'll just kind of encourage folks that if you want to head out, that's great. If you'd like to stick around and, kind of the group of participants dies down a little bit and you want to have a little bit of conversation left, I'd be happy to do that. We'll let folks that want to leave, and then if a few folks want to stick around, we can open your microphones and talk about some issues that or questions that you have. I booked this time, and honestly, I think the first time I've ever ended this early. So I thought this was going to take a lot more time to go through than it did.
Great discussions here and comments in the chat.
Yeah.
This I've never seen such a robust chat with so many wonderful questions and suggestions.
Yeah, it really is. And it's good to see that so many people are using like different aspects of the stuff that we're talking about. But again, I would really encourage people kind of going back to the stuff we talked about at the beginning is in terms of using your volunteers to recruit new volunteers is be intentional about that. Make sure volunteers understand how to do that. So if you're not covering that in your volunteer tutor training, you need to figure out a way to do that. Either cover it in your training or have some focus groups or post some tips for recruiting family and friends, Facebook, or send them out in your newsletter, but really make sure that they understand their role in helping you fill that pipeline of people.
Anybody have any other comments, questions, suggestions?
All right. Danielle, is there a way to just like open up everybody's microphone and, kind of if people want to ask questions without like having to raise their hands and stuff like that, they can do that?
That is a good question. I don't think so.
Okay. Then we'll just kind of say that if you are sticking around and you wanted to have a question, if you have a question, then we'll unmute you and you can ask it. So here's a question in the chat or in the Q&A from Denise. Does ProLiteracy offer free online training that our new volunteers can join? Yes, they do. Actually, we have a great set of comprehensive modular tutor training materials, one workshop for basic literacy tutors, one for ESL tutors. They're on our Education Network website, and Danielle can put the link in the chat. It's proliteracyednet.org. But one of the nice things is that if you're a member organization, those training materials are free and available to you, and they're free for all of your volunteers. All you have to do is make sure that when they create an account on Education Network, that they put in your organization member ID, and then they'll have access to it for free. And those materials, there's 12 modules, but they're really designed not to replicate the 15 hours, but they're designed to really be modular and to use as a resource for you to kind of refer people to when you think they need a particular module. So there's some good stuff in the beginning about just kind of understanding adult learning theory and kind of the basics of basic literacy and ESL instruction. There's some good stuff about lesson planning and assessment. For each of them, there's some kind of core skill stuff. So for basic literacy, it's phonics and decoding. There's a module on fluency. There's a module on vocabulary, one on comprehension, and one on writing. And then for ESL, there's one on vocabulary, conversation, grammar, pronunciation, reading, and writing. And then some stuff about language experience, and then some stuff about what to do in the first lesson. So Denise says their program as a member, but haven't been able to find our ID or login. So Denise, Michelle is the person to kind of talk to about your member number, but we also have another benefit that we can do for you, which is if you're a member organization, we could create a unique kind of ProLiteracy Education Network landing page for your organization. It's branded with your own URL that's based off of your organization's URL. And you can send people there in your program to create an account. And what it'll do is it'll automatically fill in that organization ID so that you don't have to worry about telling them, and you don't have to worry about them, mixing the numbers up or anything like that. And I believe Michelle has posted email us at membership@proliteracy.org, and she'll kind of hook you up with your account number and tell you a little bit more about that custom login page. But it's a really useful tool and a really easy way to then onboard your volunteer tutors onto Education Network and get them access to the tutor training. And there's no limit to the number of tutors or other staff that you can refer to take the workshops or the online training. All right, Rita says, my original question about whether members have a place to meet was actually about a full-time literacy center as opposed to our group who operates only by telephone or email. We have 48 tutors, but we don't have an actual center. Do those with a center do much more than without a center? So Rita, I can talk about like my experience in Memphis. So we started out, when I first started working there, we were just kind of sending people, it was all one-on-one tutoring. We were sending them out to libraries in their area. And one of the things that we found is that we really didn't have a good sense of like who was active and who was not, and what was kind of going on with folks. And like, it was really hard to feel like we had a good sense of if students were getting what they needed. And so we decided to move, to kind of instead move to kind of a center-based instructional approach. And some good things and bad things about that. Just one of the major things is with a center, it's a singular place. And so it requires everybody to kind of be able to get there. Kind of the benefits of libraries is their libraries are like Walgreens. There's one kind of almost within walking distance of everybody. So, but we had classrooms set up. We also had specific one-on-one tutoring areas set up, and they were kind of sequestered like you might find in a library. They were kind of carrels, cubicles type things. And then we had additional rooms. And we ran it from, I think, like 9 in the morning, basically, to 9 at night, and had, space for people to operate. And one of the things that we found, we felt like we noticed when people didn't show up, and so we could call them and support them. So that was nice. We had better attendance numbers, better intensity of instruction when we were doing a center-based approach. We were able to walk around and actually sit in on some classes and kind of observe some tutor-student pairings. So it gave us a little bit better quality control. But we also, one of the most, I think, remarkable things that we heard, a student had come up to our program from Jackson, Mississippi, I think it was. And he said, I was meeting with a tutor out in the library in Jackson, but he's like, I come here and I see like all these people, coming into school, and they're going into all these classes, and I see all these classes that I want to take. And, it makes me feel like I can't help but learn something here. Like there's so much going on and so much support. And I think that was kind of the other thing that we saw with that center-based approach. I think there's some benefits. I think there's some support benefits. There's some activity benefits, and some of that feeling like you're part of a larger thing, both for students and for volunteers. You talk about the volunteers who are looking for a social connection. We had a lot of volunteers that would, like I said, get off work, come in, classes started at 6. They got off work at 5. They didn't feel like driving out to the suburbs. So they grab something to eat. They come in, they sit at that big round table, talk to the other volunteers that were doing the same thing. So they they had those kind of social connections. And it was not just volunteers, it was volunteers and students kind of doing that and having those kind of connections. Yeah, not an area for a center in our library, and the financial issue may be a critical issue for us. How would we start that kind of center? I think it's really about finding a place that has space that will let you use it. So maybe it's a library, maybe it's a church, maybe it's maybe it's even, there are a lot of community workspaces, a YMCA or YWCA. We've got a lot of programs that are based out of those, so those are good. Maybe it's even seeing if there's like a collaborative workspace or something like that that might open their space up, or something like that for you, especially in the evenings. But I think there are a lot of places that you could start to look. But libraries also really good. Maybe talking to them and seeing if there's just an opportunity for some more designated space. I don't know. I'm open to other ideas, but those would be the places that I would look. All right. So Catherine says their program's a library program. They're the largest library in our county. Spaces are used for other programs, so it's hard when coming to doing larger groups. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that, Catherine. I really can. Yeah. And so part of it might be that you redefine kind of what is a group. When we did it, we did 15 students, but maybe you reduce that to like 5 students is what you consider a group. And 5 students with 3 tutors, that's a good tutor-student ratio. I think we would like to have that at any college we attended. Coffee shops, businesses, if you have students especially that work at the same place, maybe there's an opportunity to run some classes at businesses. VFWs, that's a great one. And also a lot of those social organizations, that have like meeting halls, Kiwanis Club, Lions Clubs, who are the other ones? The Masons. I know there are a lot of Mason buildings in St. Louis. So maybe looking at some of those organizations as well. And they have, as part of their charters, they generally have kind of social service aspects to supporting their community as part of their charters. So that might be a place to look as well. Great question. All right. Anybody else?
Well, if anybody has any questions after we leave here, I know what usually happens. You end and then you immediately think, oh gosh, why didn't I ask about X? Feel free to email us at membership@proliteracy.org. Even if we don't have the answer, we'll track down Todd and get an answer from him to give you. So that's always a resource for you. Always just reach out to us there. We're happy to help you and answer those questions that occur to you as soon as we hang up.
Or, Michelle, they can sign up for a discussion group.
Well, that too. We hope you'll sign up for discussion groups.
That's right. And they could come and ask that question. Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. So, okay. I think, why don't we call it a wrap?
Yep.
All right.
Thank you, Todd. That was
everybody, for
terrific.
attending. Really appreciate it. Hope this was helpful.